many people would say, I think the internet is an absolute source of freedom. It is the freedom to be able to access ideas and information at any time, and that should be a human right. Because if we've seen anything, we've seen that the faster ideas move, the faster they are able to evolve and grow into ideas that are more correct. Wrong ideas can be weeded out, and correct ideas can flourish. This is an integral part of a free and open and honest intellectual culture. Now, for the longest time in Canada, we've had a relatively free internet, one that suffered from very little regulation in terms of content. The only exception has been the few times that a conservative government has attempted to put through some kind of spying legislation. In 2013, the conservative Harper government attempted to introduce Bill C-30 and Bill C-55 to spy on Canadians' internet usage, all of it under the guise of fighting terrorism and protecting children. The premise was good. If you oppose the government spying on your internet use, then you must logically support terrorism and child abuse. Well, Canadians weren't having anything of it. It became an ill-fated attempt to spy on the Canadian public. It seems to be that's one of the few things that can actually get Canadians angry publicly, an attempt to spy on them individually. It would be my hope that Canadians would be angrier about other things that are also very serious matters facing the public. The greatest manifestation of this outrage was the Tell Victos Everything campaign. Victos famously said, "You're either with us or with the child pornographers." Having said that, the Canadian public decided to let Victos know everything that they were doing, and this was one of those, very small internet protests that even I myself got in on. Now, it seems that new legislation to control what Canadians are allowed to put on the internet is something that the Trudeau government and the Liberal Party have decided is something of a priority, and it's not receiving any resistance from the major parties either. This seems to be something the capitalist class really wants to do, to be able to regulate the internet to a large degree, but more importantly, in this case, to regulate what you can put on the internet. The new bill, C-10, has been introduced, and that would give sweeping powers to the federal government over internet content. The Canadian government would be able to oversee and make decisions about content on the internet, including podcasts, online videos and websites. All of it would fall under the rules of broadcast regulators. Now, make no mistake, if this legislation does indeed pass, it would mean Canada would now be subjected to the most regulated internet use in the entire world. Now, what power would this give the Canadian government? This would mean the Canadian government has the power to censor any Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, anything that any Canadian citizen places on the internet. Now, originally, there was an exemption for social media, meaning they would be exempt from this kind of control, but then that exemption mysteriously disappeared, and that is a major threat to anybody who tends to question the government, like myself. While the government was looking to regulate the internet, it didn't want to bother with anything uploaded to an online undertaking that provides social media service by a user of the service, but that clause protecting it was quickly removed. Now, you'll forgive me if I don't give a benefit of the doubt to the government saying that it won't censor myself or somebody else on social media. I tend to think they actually would. What the deletion means is that every single Canadian who posts to Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, or YouTube could be treated like a broadcaster subject to the CRTC oversight and sanction. The users themselves may not necessarily be subject to direct CRTC regulation, but the social media providers would have to answer to every post on their platform as if it were a TV show or a radio program. Interestingly, this would also cover news content, phone apps, and even video games. Now, previously they said these things would be exempt, but as we can see from the new wording, they are very much a part of it. Here's how it was put by the National Post. Bill C-10 essentially pledges to regulate online content as a program, and according to the original Broadcasting Act, a program is sounds or visual images, or a combination of sounds and visual images that are intended to inform, enlighten, or entertain. You're off the hook if your content consists of predominantly alphanumeric text, but if your website has sounds and visual images, will henceforth be a program according to Bill C-10. Now, on top of that, we should also keep in mind that in the past, the Canadian government has made threats towards social media. In September, Infrastructure Minister Catherine McKenna said that if social media companies can't regulate yourselves, governments will. With this freedom of speech threat being held over our heads, we of course are being fed a story by the Canadian government as to why we have this. This is primarily done, as they say, is to promote banning hate speech and the ability to remove it. This has also to do with the Proud Boys, which is a white supremacist organization that was recently declared a terrorist organization in Canada, and yesterday actually announced their dissolution. But I think we can all agree that this would be placed on more than just merely white supremacist content. That would mean YouTubers and other people who express an opinion would then be subject to possibly regulation by the CRTC, meaning anybody who broadcasted news or entertainment, like myself, would have to go to the Canadian government and apply for a broadcaster's license in order to be able to say what they're going to say on the internet. Whether or not they'd really do this, that remains to be seen. But this is the kind of power that the legislation actually gives, and that's quite frightening. Of course, they're just not going to give a license to anything that questions the interests of the bourgeoisie, or Canadian nationalism in general. It should be said that not all of the Canadian bourgeoisie are behind it. In fact, some have expressed outright contempt for it. Former CRTC Commissioner Peter Menzies said in an interview that Bill C-10 doesn't just infringe on free expression, it constitutes a full-blown assault upon it, and through it, the foundations of democracy. It's difficult to contemplate the levels of moral hubris, incompetence, or both that would lead people to believe such an infringement of rights is justified. I think that we can all relatively understand the kind of content that would actually be censored by this legislation. For example, if somebody ever wanted to speak against the crimes that are being committed by Israel, they would be labeled as hate speech by the government and therefore shut down or even detained. Now, this has always been a contentious issue in Canada because we have not been as pro-Israel as the United States or the UK have been. So there have still been many struggles in this area. And keep in mind, there have been court cases already that have decided that choosing not to buy Israeli products isn't hate speech. That's right, capitalism had to go to court to figure that out. That you had the choice to not buy products from Israel, and that was a freedom that you had. Of course, capitalism is predicated on the freedom of being able to choose, but, why let that get in the way? Another major issue that would be facing anybody who dared criticize the government would be much of the information that's floating around about indigenous resistance to land theft, and many of the land claims or the standoffs that have taken place in the last few years, particularly with regards to the XL pipeline, to many of the outstanding land claims that are still going on in Canada, some of them still going on, in other words, still having standoffs this very day. The position of Aboriginal leaders and Aboriginal rights would eventually end up getting sanctioned by the CRTC if they didn't come from what would be considered a reputable source like the mainstream media, or APTN for that matter. If you were just an individual who happened to disagree and wanted to phrase it in a way that was not considered palatable by the bourgeoisie, you too could find yourself being censored. And I think that that's mainly what would be used in this case. Censorship against Israel, against criticism of Israel, and any speech in favor of indigenous rights in Canada. That is not to say that it wouldn't be used on other issues as well. But here's the really interesting part. What are we looking at right here? This is capitalism. We are in a capitalist system right now, and it is doing all of the censorship. It's doing all of the boogeyman stuff that they said would happen under communism. You wouldn't be allowed to say anything. You wouldn't be allowed to criticize anybody, and you all would be shot if you said anything in public more than one syllable or some kind of nonsense like that. And expect Stalin to come to your door any minute now for criticizing your breakfast. But what are we seeing? We're seeing this happen right under capitalism itself. This is the system that we're living in. It is capitalism that is trying to regulate speech in order for what is essentially the interests of the bourgeoisie, to control what you can and cannot say publicly. Because if they weren't trying to control it, they wouldn't be trying to put this legislation through to begin with. This is here to keep us from being able to criticize them. Because this legislation serves really no other purpose in general. Hate speech is already illegal. You know, saying anything in support of terrorist groups or terrorist groups' propaganda is already illegal and already gets removed anyway. So why would you need to write this legislation for that? This serves no other purpose than to censor the public from being able to criticize not the government, but the interests of the bourgeoisie. If you want to call Stephen Harper a cuck, if you want to call Trudeau a cuck, hey, you're allowed to do that. If you want to call whoever it is that's in charge of the Conservative Party now, it keeps changing, a Nazi, that's okay. If you wanted to challenge Canadian interests in Afghanistan, that might be a different story. That is going to get censored, and the media is going to portray you as a terrorist sympathizer, etc. So this isn't just about criticizing the government. This is about criticizing the interests of the bourgeoisie. That is what the censorship is really about. It's not about, oh, you said something against the government, therefore you're going to go. Because you can criticize the government all day long, as it's a milquetoast, meaningless thing, and even a rightful criticism. Hell, criticize the tax code. Scream bloody murder because somebody asked you to wear a mask. But in the end, it's the interest of the bourgeoisie that they're trying to protect here. That is what is going to be censored. And that, I believe, is really the point of this legislation, and what all of this is lined up perfectly to do. This is the threat that we are facing as Canadians. A fully regulated internet that would allow the bourgeoisie to literally dictate what opinion you are allowed to have.
Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.